right, I think we will get started. Today it is my pleasure to introduce two, not three speakers from my lab. Unfortunately, there was a family emergency, and so Emil will not be joining us today, so we will have lots of time for questions as a result. But we've got two speakers from my lab today who will be showing off very different projects. So this, I think, is really a testament to the diversity and heterogeneity of the work that they're all doing, and it's really sophisticated. And they're really, really different from each other. And so I hope that there will be something for everybody here. So first I'll introduce Rochelle, who'll go first, and then Ali, who is postdoc in the lab, will go second. And each talk is about, 12 to 15 minutes long, and then we'll have some nice time for questions afterwards, and then I'll get out of here a little bit early. Okay, so Rochelle Kaper is a second-year PhD student here in this department. She has a master's in cognitive sciences from RPI, which she got in 2004, 2024. I've been born in 2000. Yeah, okay, 2024 is the two. And then she entered our program here in fall of 24 and has been working with me on structure learning and computational models and behavioral assessments of that. The work that she'll present today is the culmination of the last about year and a bit of work. And it's produced two manuscripts now, both of which are under review. And so I think I will just pass the microphone to Rochelle and let her tell you about the awesome work that she's been doing. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. The title of my talk today is Metacognition and Stimulus Familiarity Drive Structure Learning and Representational Compactness. So we experience the world as a continuous visual stream, yet we extract patterns and represent information in a compact, efficient manner to achieve our goals. Imagine you were visiting an animal sanctuary and you're figuring out the best order to visit the animals. You might organize the animals into pairs according to their regions, or maybe you represent the structure hierarchically. We're interested in understanding how people extract and internalize such structures from their environments. And crucially, such structure learning often occurs without explicit external feedback. Here, metacognition, or the monitoring of one's own cognitive processes, can serve as feedback to guide learning. For instance, when uncertain, people can actually use the signal to guide additional information seeking before deciding. However, whether metacognitive processes can change across learning and how that might shape structural learning and hierarchical representations is unknown. And although prior knowledge of the animals might affect how we represent information here in pairs or hierarchically, we don't know how stimulus familiarity might also interact with such hierarchical structural learning and metacognition. Today, using a novel behavioral paradigm and computational modeling, I will illustrate how metacognition and stimulus familiarity play key roles in driving structural learning and representational compactness. We developed a novel hierarchical structural learning task to look at how learning without feedback and metacognition co-evolved over time. Participants completed 2 sessions counterbalanced, each with a learn phase followed by a test phase across 6 blocks, but each with a stimulus type that differ in familiarity. So we have these unfamiliar fractals and then familiar line drawings that are just everyday objects. And then during learning, participants would view sequential pairs of stimuli while doing a cover task. But unknown to the participants, this visual stream actually contained a hierarchical structure. We have, at the lower level, co-occurrences or associated items. For instance, A and A prime can co-occur together in either spatial orientation, so A and A prime or A prime and A. And then there's a global level, which is the probabilistic sequence of these co-occurrences, where usually node 1 would transition to node 2, but sometimes it can skip and go straight to node 3. And then after each learn phase, they would do a test phase, where participants indicate which item is most likely to occur with the reference stimulus in a 5 alternative forced choice task or a 5 AFC, and then they would rate their confidence. Next, they would indicate which 2 items are most likely to occur after the pair of items that they just created, and then they would rate their confidence in their first and second selection. Now jumping right into our main findings. While participants learn the structures, we see very distinct learning dynamics for the structures by the stimulus set. Over here, we have the co-occurrences, and then the middle and the right panel is the sequence separated by the first and second selection. Generally, we see higher accuracy for the line drawings, but if we look at the fractals in pink, we observe higher sequence accuracy compared to their co-occurrence accuracy. And the opposite pattern occurred for the line drawings, where in blue, we see higher co-occurrence accuracy than the sequence accuracy in both selections for the line drawings. Now, we were also interested in how participants' evaluation of their own learning or metacognitive sensitivity evolved over time. This is the change in correspondence between accuracy and confidence, quantified as the area under the type 2 ROC curve, or AUROC2, which reflects someone's ability to distinguish between the correct and incorrect decisions. And so someone with higher metacognitive sensitivity above 0.5 would have higher confidence for their correct decisions than incorrect ones. And now looking at the fractals in pink, metacognitive sensitivity increased alongside learning. On the contrary, for line drawings, even though metacognitive sensitivity was generally higher, they weren't getting any better at evaluating their own learning while they were learning. And for both stimulus sets, we see that metacognitive sensitivity was actually lower for the sequence structure than the co-occurrence. And now these results aren't just a simple consequence of accuracy because we just saw that accuracy was increasing across the blocks for the line drawings, and in fact, was higher in the sequence than the co-occurrences for the fractals. In all, we find that stimulus familiarity shapes hierarchical structure learning and metacognitive dynamics. Specifically, metacognitive judgments about the structures might be disproportionately influenced by confidence about the stimulus encoding. And we also saw that for the fractals, sequences showed higher performance than the co-occurrences. And this seems a bit counterintuitive, as you would expect co-occurrences should be easier to learn since the sequence is made up of the individual co-occurrences. It might be, though, that unfamiliar stimuli use up more working memory capacity for encoding the stimuli, leaving less resources available for actually acquiring the structures. And while we didn't really measure working memory capacity, this is aligned with a lot of prior work that looked at the role of working memory in stimuli. This raises questions, though, about whether these differences between the stimuli and learning and metacognitive sensitivity might be attributed to how the structures are being represented. We next turn to computational modeling, therefore, to ask, how do hierarchical representations differ among the stimuli to influence learning, and how are these representations modulated by metacognitive sensitivity? Unlike standard reinforcement learning algorithms, successor representations, or SRs, have been used to provide biologically plausible explanations into how biological agents might learn and represent hierarchical structures. A SR learner builds a compact predictive representation where states are encoded in terms of their future or successor states. Now, our task was concerned with participants learning the associated items or co-occurrences and the sequence structure. But as I previously mentioned, unfamiliar stimuli may use up more working memory capacity for encoding, leaving less resources available for acquiring the structures. Because of these constraints, rather than representing the co-occurrences and sequence structures as two distinct entities, participants may have actually formed some compact hierarchical representation that blends the structure representations together. And an SR would let us capture this. The question then is whether the compactness of the SR might interact with working memory capacity and participants' metacognitive sensitivity. And crucially, representational compactness could provide an explanation for the stimulus differences we just saw in learning and metacognitive sensitivity in the behavior. So recall that participants were asked what item was most likely to occur with the reference stimulus. We wanted to know if decisions made about the co-occurrences were driven by some blended compact representation of the co-occurrence and sequence structures. Another way of thinking about it is if sequential information is leaking into the decisions made about the co-occurrences. We first collapse each stimulus to be represented by the node it belongs to. For instance, A and A prime belong to node 1, B and B prime belong to node 2, and so on. So we collapsed it. And a key component of the SR is that the representation is weighted by a discount factor, which controls how much future nodes are represented. On average, if you answered correctly that node 1 appears with reference node 1, you'd be primarily representing co-occurrence information and therefore have a lower discount factor. But this structure is probabilistic, where most of the time node 1 transitions to node 2, but sometimes it can also skip to node 3. Therefore, for instance, if participants are primarily selecting node 2 or node 3 in their response, then they would be more sensitive to the sequential structure because they're representing future nodes more and would therefore have a larger discount factor. And now I'll walk through the model fitting here. This SR model models an ideal observer who has knowledge of the probabilistic task structure. For each participant in each stimulus group, we fit an SR to their 5 alternative force choice or 5 AFC co-occurrence choice data using logistic regression of the form. Where for each option in this 5 AFC, the log probability is computed given the reference node. And this model just has 2 parameters. We have SR, which is a predictive matrix that represents how similar any 5 AFC option is to the reference node, and the identity matrix I, with respect to the probabilistic structure stored in transition matrix T, and the distance between the nodes. And then from the SR, we derive gamma, the discount factor between 0 to 1, which again captures how much someone is sensitive to the sequential structure. And then finally, beta is just a sensitivity parameter that indicates how much this SR is even weighed in one's choices. So in short, this SR is a predictive representation weighted by a discount factor, and then beta weighs how much the SR influences choices. And now we can look at how these parameters might differ across subjects as a function of stimulus type. These are the posterior means for each parameter by stimulus set for all subjects. Looking at discount factor first on the left, the fractals in pink, participants are showing a larger discount factor, suggesting that when they were learning the hierarchical structure, they likely had a more compact representation where the structure levels were blended together in the representations. And this result might explain why for the fractals, we saw higher sequence accuracy compared to the co-occurrence accuracy. And then looking at beta on the right, the line drawings showed a higher beta, meaning that the representations carried more weight for their decisions. This pattern suggests a trade-off between the discount factor within the representation and reliance on this representation in decision-making. But recall that we also saw different metacognitive sensitivity patterns between the stimuli. So we next asked whether metacognitive sensitivity might help explain this rather surprising trade-off. We correlated our metacognitive sensitivity metric AUROC2 on the x-axis with each of the SR parameters for each participant. Looking at discount factor first, for only fractals in pink, greater metacognitive sensitivity is associated with a less compact successor representation, meaning that the co-occurrences and sequence structures are now more distinctly represented. And now looking at beta, again, for only fractals in the pink, greater metacognitive sensitivity is associated with more weight on their representations and decisions. So in the first part of the talk, I showed you that stimulus familiarity shapes hierarchical structure learning and metacognitive dynamics. Because the fractals were unfamiliar, they likely needed more resources for encoding, leading to working memory capacity available for learning the structures. This likely resulted in a more compact hierarchical representation that blended the structure levels. So our successor representation model revealed a stimulus-dependent trade-off between the discount factor in the hierarchical representations and the weighting of these representations and choices. Crucially for fractals, this surprising trade-off was governed by metacognitive sensitivity. So with higher metacognitive sensitivity, participants had more distinct representations of the structure levels and representations that were more likely to be used in their choices. It does seem resource rational that people wouldn't just adapt their learning and representations to environmental statistics, but also to their working memory capacity as modulated by metacognitive sensitivity. And we think these findings, therefore, have theoretical implications for considering how rigid or malleable these cognitive systems really are in regards to learning and deciding under uncertainty. And finally, it takes a team, and I really want to thank mine. First and foremost, thank you so much to my amazing advisor, Dr. Megan Peters, for her unwavering support. Thank you to my lab mates in the reflection lab. A sincere thank you to Alexa Boris, Dr. Erin Bornstein, Ari Kadari, Dr. Liz Krastel, and the Krastel lab for their feedback and support. Thank you so much to Armand, Jerry, Brody, Xiaobin, Rohan, Dr. Jeff Router, and Cindy. Lastly, I thought I had less time for this presentation, so I couldn't cover everything. So please go check out our preprint if you're interested in reading more about it. And finally, thank you so much to everyone here today. Trainee question for
No, you're right. Question first. No, run this the colloquium committee right. I was just gonna ask again, what the future directions were for this research.
Great question. So this computational model SR that we built, it models an ideal observer. So it's not directly modeling learning dynamics. And part of the reason for that was to not enough learning trials to like acquire the information needed for that. So right now, as part of a collaboration with Dr. Liz Crostal, we're working on a model that actually learns through the learning phase, like what the participants are learning. And we can look at the beta weight and the discount factor also as varying over time across learning and how they might interact with metacognitive sensitivity over time.
Interesting, thank you. Yeah.
No.
Is it open to?
Oh, yes, but.
Question really smart. Can you go back to the graph, the graph of the hierarchical learning structure? I just wanted to understand a bit about the probabilities. Yeah, like, are the probabilities the same between the levels of like co-occurrence and sequence probabilities? Like, what are those values? Are they not one? And what are they? And are they equated? Yeah.
That's what T was.
Yeah.
Great.
So in this version, the transition probability and the co-occurrence probability were equal, but they differed across the stimulus sets. Part of that was in pilot studies, the people doing line drawings were too good at it, like very annoyingly good. So, because when you're trying to study learning and metacognition over time, you don't want learning to reach ceiling really quickly. So basically, for the fractals, the transition and co-occurrence probability, I believe, is 0.92. And then 8% of the time, you would have a skip in the sequence, for instance. So node 1 would go to node 3, and the same thing would happen for all the nodes. And then for the co-occurrences, I didn't get into this, but usually like 92% of the time for fractals, let's say A and A prime co-occur together in either spatial orientation. And that 8% of the time, though, it's randomly sampled from 72 pairs. That's why I didn't go into it. But yeah, and then for line drawings, it's a little harder. It's like 83% transition probability in
They're mapped. The co-occurrence transition probability and the sequence transition probability are mapped.
In this version.
Instant.
Yeah.
So.
In our new version, it won't be.
And I guess maybe a broader question then is there a fundamental difference that you see between simultaneous prediction and sequential prediction? Like, sort of, like, do you see, like, I guess implicitly you're saying that they're hierarchical in time, like, but what if it was like, 2 seconds versus 10 seconds? Or like, is there, like, how do you unify these representations in your theory?
So to understand your question, you mean spatially or?
Fundamentally, what is the difference between simultaneous co-occurrence and sequential co-occurrence? Like, is there, this is too broad a question, potentially this is too broad a question, but I have often wondered this, right? Because I think this is really important. A lot of the literature, there's models of learning that are about co-occurring stimuli, and there's models of learning about sequential stimuli, and they're rarely put together. And I think this is really awesome. But like, do you see them as just kind of part of the same continuum of time, or are they like fundamentally? Is there a reason to believe they could be fundamentally different things? I don't know. This is a very broad question.
No, that's a great question. I think even fundamentally, co-occurrences would be more about like learning something spatial, because at least in our task, they're presented at the same time. And then sequence is literally, the temporal order of the co-occurrences.
So like different parts of the medial temporal lobe, for example, might be involved in those two types of relations.
Yeah.
So it's like look at. But that is part of why we wanted to do a hierarchical structure, is because often in literature they do co-occurrences separately, even though the real world's
separate processes rather than like literally a hierarchy over the same thing. Like you could have two different parts of the brain learning them separately.
You could, yeah.
Okay, I'd love to talk about
Yeah.
So I was just wondering, in your future work, are you planning on having like a systematic manipulation of these transition co-occurrence versus sequence probabilities? Because it seems like that would be an incredibly powerful way of teasing apart these processes and no matter how hard it is. I guess I'm just saying I really recommend that.
We should talk more of that.
Okay.
Yeah, not it.
Super cool talk, interview. Okay, so this is a general question, but your task strikes me as a little bit different than the example you started with animals, where there's like a structure and category and a theory of what like holds these categories together, and there's like a subordinate category and a superordinate category of mammals. I'm assuming that these fractal and line drawings are just completely random and they have no association with one another in your task? Okay. Do you have any sense of how that may play out if they weren't, or do you see any evidence that they're forming some theory of how these things co-occur, or why there's a sequence to these things in some way?
Yeah, good question. The example I gave in the beginning, yeah, I agree. It was more about like building categories than it would be in this task. For the line drawings, I think part of the differences we see from familiarity is that participants might actually be able to readily form categories or like semantic associations with the line drawings. But even with fractals that are unfamiliar, you can still think of something to label them. So we thought this was more about familiarity as a whole than just verbalization. I guess in terms of if participants are forming some hierarchical structure, I don't think it would be literally forming categories. I think it would be something to do with blending them together. I didn't want to say the C word compression, but I think that would have something to do with it, and it'd be really interesting to investigate that neurally using fMRI or something. Yeah, Mark.
Have you looked at the metacognitive sensitivity of the co-occurrence task and the sequential task sort of plotted against each other? So are there trade-offs at the individual subject level where one person might invest more sort of energy in one task versus the other, and that you would see that? I think you do this through the modeling at the moment. I couldn't quite follow the model, but is there sort of an empirical signature of a trade-off?
Yeah, we didn't, I guess, for the behavior, we like to do it this way. We also did like correlations between the learning and metacognitive sensitivity with the behavior, and we have that in our preprint. But that was something interesting, yeah. To look at.
T is being, so think again, there's one in TB.
On the previous slide, you had your little simile, and you mentioned that maybe the fractals are harder to do certain types of learning with because you have to encode them first. I was wondering, what do you think would happen if you had made the line drawings also novel, in the sense that perhaps it's not necessarily the encoding aspect that's making it difficult, it's actually that the line drawings are easier to manipulate with because you have familiar structures in your memory that you can lean on. So I was thinking, what if you instead had presented like fantasy animals that, you know, share a lot of the structures of real animals, but are still novel to the participant?
Or upside down animals.
Greebles or something like that. Yeah, something that's got like some of those same things. Yeah, that's a great idea.
Yeah, we didn't, I guess, do more stimulus manipulations because some have been done when they looked at working memory capacity in general, because we were also thinking like, is this not just familiarity, but visual complexity? In that case, fractals are harder. But a lot of studies found that if you're looking at familiarity and complexity compared together, complexity basically, like the effects of complexity essentially go away. So even if you made the line drawings more complex, like you made them upside down or less familiar, I still think we would see similar results against the fractals. But it'd be interesting to look at.
All right, thanks, Rochelle. Right.